further some more audience. So thank you all very much for coming here. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Ayad Al-Ani. I'm an associate member here at the Einstein Center Digital Future here in Berlin. I also teach at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Together with my colleague Carsten Siebert, we have been working on the topic of museums in the MENA region for some time now. We will introduce the findings of our discussions in the past year, but we are even more delighted to have some very distinguished guests here amongst us. And allow me to introduce them to you, and also the agenda. So with us, and I'm very happy that was possible on the short notice, is Professor Sandra Kenderdine from the University Polytechnique in Switzerland, from Lausanne. She's a prominent expert in digital museology, experimental museology, and she will give us a short introduction on what is really possible. So we have been talking a lot about digital transformation of museums, but I think it would be very interesting to, first of all, understand what the possibilities, what the options are in terms of digitization. So we are very happy to have you here, Mrs. Kenderdine. Second agenda point would be to give you a feedback from Carsten Siebert and myself concerning our discussions we had with experts in the Arab world concerning the digitization of Arab museums, also to understand their strategies, and also to discuss with you 3 ideas which had been presented to us. And we would very much like to have your feedback on that one. Third, one of the interview partners we had was the Arab Image Foundation from Beirut, and we were very impressed by the transformation efforts that they had undertaken, and we are very happy, therefore, that Christine Khoury would be here. She's a member of the board of the Arab Image Foundation, to present to us how easy or how difficult it was to embark on digital transformation, and what the plans of the Arab Image Foundations are in that regard. But we will not only talk about museums and their place in the digital transformation, we would also like to discuss the impact on arts, and I'm very happy that we have Nora El-Bedri here. Nora is this distinguished media artist, and I think she will present to us also some of her projects that are dealing with the topic of artificial intelligence and art and the Arab world. So we have everything together. With that, I hope you find the program interesting and worthwhile. I will ask each of us to make a short presentation of about 10 to 15 minutes. Then you will have the chance to ask questions. You can do that directly or by using the chat function in your Zoom application. And then we see how the discussion goes, and if that is a good idea, we could have some further discussion at the end of all 4 presentations. So I think there's time enough for your feedback. And having said that, I would invite Mrs. Kenderdine to start with her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen, and so thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ani. You're a great vision behind this program today, and I'm very honored to be involved, and also with the co-speakers. The ideas that I want to explore are from the Laboratory for Experimental Museology that I run here at the EPFL in Switzerland, and it engages in research from scientific, humanistic, and artistic perspectives, and promotes a post-cinematic multi-sensory engagement using experimental platforms in the co-creation of experience. And while I'm not going to present work that's directly from the MENA region, I think that the themes that I present, I hope, are inspiring to all of you. Let's change slides. So just a little bit of background. I've been building large-scale immersive systems inside museums for 20 years, and originally from the museum sector. I then started to collaborate with universities because I was looking for a mechanism to help sustain this kind of infrastructure across the GLAM sector, and universities were a mechanism to do that. I then co-established the Applied Laboratory for Interactive Visualization and Embodiment at the Hong Kong Science Park in Hong Kong with City University, and I might just move this bar from my screen, yeah. And then I went on to I returned to Australia and I built the Expanded Perception and Interaction Center at UNSW. Just so you know what you're looking at, on the right-hand side is a small 7-meter diameter panorama, but it's comprised of 56 projectors and a 29 computer cluster, and it was really designed to solve visualization challenges in the humanities and the sciences for big data. And now at the EPFL, 12 large-scale immersive systems that offer us strategies for multi-sensory engagement, emphasizing human-to-human as well as human-to-machine interaction, giving us powerful ways to reformulate narrative in a digital context. I've chosen 3 themes: community collaborations, participatory experiences, and deep mapping to give you a spectrum. So we've been working a lot with community projects. This one in particular is related to South Chinese Kung Fu and Kung Fu masters from Hong Kong. Hong Kong, as you're probably aware, is an extraordinary reservoir of intangible cultural heritage of the Hakka people. And from the early to the mid-20th century, Hong Kong provided refuge for teeming thousands of migrants from mainland China, and among them some of the most prominent martial artists in the world. But with globalization, urbanization, dwindling numbers of practitioners, this living heritage made internationally so famous by Jackie Chan, Gordon Liu, and Hong Kong cinema was on the brink of becoming lost. The archive, the community of practitioners, 33 elite masters came to the university where I was working and said, you know, you have all this fancy technology, what can you do for us? And they have a long and abiding interest in technology for transmission. So first photography, then film, and now motion capture, as you see here. We're documenting all facets, including ritual culture and so on. We've documented all of the taolu, which are the weapons training sequences. And what you can see here is the wireframe from one of these masters and automated annotation of the motion over time analysis. So there's 2 things going on with this archive. We've had 9 exhibitions worldwide: Australia, Hong Kong, China, Macau, and also in Switzerland, in Europe. And now the Hong Kong government is building a large-scale museum, well, small-scale museum actually, and a repository for the digital archive. So these marginalized community members now have a place where this archive can continue to be built. Just to give you an insight in the type of technologies, this is a rear projected stereo 3D system where you can look at from all perspectives of a Kung Fu master's motions. It has an interactive interface, and you can change the ways in which the motion is annotated. This analysis relates to speed on the body at any moment in time, and this is a typical particle simulation. So the theorist Brian Rockman uses this idea of corporal haptic writing, or the corporeal of gestural haptic writing, actually. And he talks about the fact that motion capture provides us with a continuous topological model which allows for the easier attainment of the effective qualities of movement. So all these visualization strategies are really within the realms of that. And it echoes advances in Labo notation. It's continuing to advance automated systems for describing and analyzing human movement, a set of resources for teaching and learning through simulation, applications in serious games, museums, exhibits, and also in robotics. We're working on a deep level ontological framework for it, and I have a full team now working on that, and it's an ongoing project, we could say. Just to give you a little insight into some of the curious things that we are building. So this is Lam Sai Wing, first Kung Fu master to use photography in studio practice in the 20s and 30s. We also have hand drawings of him. Out of the hand drawings and the photographs, we were able to build a model of him. And then we applied the motion capture data set from his great-great-grandnephew. So it's quite a strange, we could say, archival object, a little bit DNA, a little bit. Diana Taylor also talks about the way in which the archive can provide knowledge transfer capabilities. And so this is also an important aspect. She says, embodied in the form, generate, record, and transmit knowledge. So what we're looking at here are the strategies for doing that within an exhibitionary complex. Other forms of documentation include ultra high-speed video, 1,000 frames a second. This is Master Yao Wan Hua. And we're also capturing the rituals and ceremonies. As I mentioned, this is a Taoist festival. It's held once every 10 years. And the reason I chose to include it is because it celebrates the end of a pandemic. It has about 30 dragons, unicorns, and lions in this ceremony. You can see the Taoist priests in the yellow. It's a big haka event. In collaboration with the National Museum of Australia, we had the possibility to work on this project together with the Anagu elders. They came to the museum and they said, our songline is dying. What can we do to bring it into the public domain and help try and ensure its continuity? So it was a very long process. It took 7 years to negotiate between the museum and the elders. And we were able to image a cave, a sacred cave, which had never been imaged before, gigapixel imaging, photogrammetry, time-lapse panoramas, drone-based panoramas, and so on, ambisonics. So all of these were combined to narrate this story. It's associated with Orion and Pleiades. It's a profound sort of meta-narrative in the formation of Australia and the travelling of the country. It's also a morality tale. And the second dome experience was working with the Matu artists. They created a series of jumpy figures, as they're called. This is them singing them off the land into the museum's collections. Looks a bit bleak, really. Here we are making photogrammetric models of them. They also painted a series of images for the full dome. Some of these artists have incredible vision to look at hemispherical distortion in the creation of their work. And then we could, these were heavily annotated and interpreted for us to be able to animate these in another full-blown movie. So this is a shot from the opening, and it was really a major watershed in indigenous and curatorial relationships with the National Museum and the national government. Its long gestation period is something that one must bear in mind about doing collaborative works like this with community that live really in different modalities of time and space. And one of the other interesting things is I lent my full dome to the museum for this particular work, and afterwards they bought a full dome themselves. So this ability to support museums in developing these kinds of works, which are high-end, is really important to the work I'm doing. And they will now tour this all over the world. It will come to Europe, I think Paris and Berlin. Another aspect is the participatory interface and what that allows us. This is Jazz Luminaries. It's a constellation of jazz greats from the EPFL digitized Montreux Jazz Archive, and it cuts, remixes and replays 5,400 artists and 13,000 videos. It's a memory of the world archive. It's taken 15 years to digitize, so it's very important. The neural net type image that you see there and all the little nodes within it are artists, and the link strength is defined by the number of time and one artist played with another artist. So at the very center of that network is, in fact, B.B. King. You lie under a dome, you're using a spherical interface to navigate this constellation, emulating the hemisphere of the full dome in which it's staged. The search paradigm is like tuning a radio. There's no text function in this work. And this circumvents the lack of public knowledge into who jazz greats actually are. And hearing what you like helps you drive the design to unfold in 3 layers. You sample, you have all songs from that artist, and then you have a full song. So archival reuse is a really important aspect of computational museology as we increasingly digitize all our materials. Another example, different type of data. This is laser scan from Dongguan. It's a World Heritage Site in northernmost China. And I'm not going to describe the work so much as look at the interface itself for what it offers and what it means inside the public domain. So originally done actually for Art Basel in Hong Kong, it's been shown to nearly 1 million people. And you are navigating inside this world at 1-to-1 scale. The wireframe from the laser scan has been printed on the walls, and what's important is the way that it harnesses socialization around a single screen, because socialization is really at the core of the museum experience. It's often amongst strangers or family groups, and it's the core of interpretation. Young kids, middle-aged ladies, grandmother and grandchild. Grandmother abandons the grandchild, takes off the screen. So multi-generational interfaces are very important. And this is another trope which emerges from a work like this. This is the wife. She takes an iPad from her handbag and she's filming her husband's experience as if they were really there. Now, I'm going to whiz through this simply to say that the interesting thing about the MENA region and the networks across the MENA region are simply that they are networks. There are great things to tell, great stories to tell within networks. And I've just finished a project, the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism, spread of Buddhism from South India through Southeast Asia, up into China, down into Korea and Japan. It was a 6-year project. It's a counter-narrative to the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is currently reaching into all of these areas. And it spans the 2nd century BCE to the 14th century CE. I'm not going to go through the narrative because what I just really want to show is the imaging that a project of just 3 people can generate. So gigapixel imaging shown here, and we documented hundreds and hundreds of sites. We used very simple tools. This is an analog stereographic camera. You can drum scan these images to any resolution. These are relatively inexpensive cameras, and there were just 3 of us doing this project every time we could get back into the field. Ambisonics for sound recording and architecture. So I'm not going to explain it all, but there is absolutely gorgeous material in here. And we have just completed a big museum project in Taiwan, actually. And I'm just going to jump to this. This is the panoramic view, the archaeological selection view. We also did a whole range of photogrammetry, and this has been really quite extraordinary because we've been able to document all of those objects that never leave their countries. They're all national treasures, and are able to travel in digital form and so I will jump to the end to say that this is Avalokiteshvara. By the time Avalokiteshvara moves from India and Sri Lanka and meets China, he is transformed into a sea goddess called Guanyin. And so through this iconographic collection, we can trace the history of Buddhism. And this is the exhibition. It's open last month, and we open another one in the first week of July. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kenderdine, for your amazing presentation and the insights. Are there any questions right now? And before that, maybe you would allow me one question, and I think we discussed that up front a little bit, is that while this is all very impressive, we were looking for also possibilities that are available to, let's say, museums in poorer countries.
Yeah.
So what is your, I understand that some of those techniques are very expensive. Some of these techniques are rather inexpensive.
Yeah.
So what is your take on that?
So I think we live in a great time because the improvement in photogrammetry, for instance, which anybody can do photogrammetry, you just need a camera and a computer. And you can create very, very high resolution, high fidelity models of any kind of collection. And the other types of fieldwork technologies we're using are very inexpensive. Yeah, so analog cameras are not something I would recommend. But so I think that the opportunity to digitize is much cheaper. The opportunity to do interesting things on the internet with that data is also not so expensive. The third component, which is really where I work a lot, is in the infrastructure area. And so that's a slightly different thing. But once you have these powerful collections, you can do so much with them. They endlessly give back to you. They are a reservoir for recreation of work in different forms. And if you do them well, then those archives will be reused in numerous times. And as times change, you get more funding or whatever, then you're able to realize these installations also in galleries.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? If not, then we have the opportunity to discuss at the end of the session. If there are no questions now, then I would switch over to our presentation and now enter the MENA region. So, when Carsten Siebert and I started on this project, we were looking for ways onto how to discuss the topic of digital transformation in the Arab world. So there were a couple of questions that were haunting us, so to say, and here are a couple of them. So one is, can we use arts and culture to assimilate digitization in the Arab world? Or is there the possibility of an Arab digital culture that can direct, encourage, empower, open up, regulate, or even criticize digital projects in the region? So that was one very important aspect, because we realized that in many Arab countries, the political situation is such that a discussion of the future of a society is quite difficult. So we were looking for spaces where we can have this kind of assimilation, and very quickly we came to the topic of museums, and we were asking ourselves the questions, and we were asking our interview partners, can museums in the region be such places for change? Which to some sounded very odd, of course, but we were pushing the discussion onward. And then once we discussed with our partners, you know, how or whether museums could be such places for change, we very quickly came to the topic that Professor Kenderdine has touched now as well, is must museums change first in order to be such places for change in their societies? And if that is the case, you know, what are viable strategies available? So these were the three questions that were triggering us, and we were very much encouraged. And Carsten, could you take this one up?
Absolutely. I thought it was truly interesting to hear Sarah Kenderdine talk about the ways in which digital technology sort of empowers the archiving and the maintaining of traditions as well as objects in themselves in many ways. And this is sort of what got us started on this journey. This is, of course, at the heart of the new or not yet adopted alternative museum definition put out by ICOM, I think, well, a few years ago, in 19 or something, where I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but I will read this because it's important. What happened was that there's a huge discussion within the International Council of Museums on the definition of what a museum really is. And it's moving away from, say, physical preservation, conservation of pieces, and sort of these scientific aspects, the scientific or academic work on specific objects, artworks or others, more towards a more socially defined function. And this is basically a definition that was thrown out there. It's not been adopted. It's been widely and viciously discussed and will continue to be so. So don't hold your breath for any adoption soon, I would say. But it is. Museums are democratizing, inclusive and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures. Note the plural, right? Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. This is so much in the line with what Sarah was presenting earlier that I found was the most congenial intro we could possibly have here. Museums are not for profit. They are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. And this is exactly why I think this is, of course, not purely a topic for the MENA region. because all museums the world over are currently struggling with what this even means. What does that mean? You know, you used to have a collection and you put it out and you let people in, they could look at it and take something home from that encounter or not, whatever the case may be. You may have tried to help them along the way by explaining certain things and not explaining others, but this is a far more holistic, if you wish, definition of what museums are actually there for. And to us, it sounded like this is something that is particularly, but not exclusively, lacking in the MENA region, at the same time where most museum spaces in their own definition are trying to do something like that. Because even the whole idea of museums being the recipient of a specific national culture and help, you know, being sort of the incarnation of a specific national tradition is something that is very, very strong in my experience in museums in the MENA region. And the question is, basically what we would like to do is to sort of try to find out whether there are links, or what links there may be to get this kind of definition into the existing or potentially new institutions. Ayad.
Thank you. Yeah, and then of course we ask ourselves, you know, if that is a possible aim for a museum, are there already museums that resemble the thing that we had in mind? You know, are there museums that talk about the future or discuss the future? And of course there aren't many, because this is probably not the most traditional view to look at a museum. Although we did find some examples where, for instance, here in Berlin, there was a theater group that invited scientists, for instance, to discuss with them how the future could look like. And this discussion then was entered into the theater play. So we found that this was a very fascinating conjuncture of arts and science. And the museum, or in this case, the Humboldt Museum, the Humboldt Castle in Berlin, was the platform for doing that. So museum is not always about the past, although the way you talk about the past always tells you how the future would look like. But there are, I think, very new ways of discussing the future, and you could use culture as a vehicle for that. Of course, there are museums dedicated to the future, like also one here in Berlin called the Futurium, which is dealing with possible futures. So we found that interesting, although it became clear to us that this, of course, is still a kind of niche. We were very impressed by the Museum of Applied Arts in Austria, which for some time has embarked on the story on how to assimilate digital tools, digital gadgets for the society. So they were opening up labs that could be used for hackathons and discussion purposes. And their aim was finding a narrative with the civil society and participants who are interested in trying to figure out, you know, if all this technology comes true, how will our society look like? And they also, of course, had a very critical view on some of the issues. So there were some examples which guided us in the discussion we had with our partners. We then embarked on a discussion, and I think we had seven interviews. So not hundreds, but 7. I have to admit that. 2 of them in Lebanon, one in Palestine, one in Tunisia, and one in Egypt. And we try to figure out, you know, what do Arab museums think of digitization, and how do they use it, and is it within their strategy? And we, of course, trying to be very simplistic at the end of the day, try to categorize the different countries, although this of course is always a bit unfair to the different players. But I thought we were really able to do that at one point. and try to figure out, are there different strategies in different countries and where do they end up? So first of all, I have to admit, we didn't find any museum in the Arab world that resembles this category of museum for change that at least we had in mind. That this was not a surprise, and of course, the idea we had in mind was quite crazy, and we knew that. So we were thinking,
and Ayad, we would find very few the world over, I would say. So again, not necessarily typical for the region as such.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it was still interesting to see that there are different countries with different strategies. Of course, that also depends on the socioeconomic basis which you have. So we found countries in Egypt where museums are very important for the narrative of the traditional heritage. And although we found that digitization is also a topic here, and it is not always a skill issue, that was also interesting for us. Countries like Egypt seem to be very reluctant entering this, and that has many factors. It has, I think, also to do with the fact that museums are there to describe a glorious past, and some of those museums are also geared towards Western tourists coming into the country. But what we also found interesting is that there seems to be a reluctance to so to say upload artifacts into a kind of database, and that had to do with the fact that they were sometimes afraid that they would have or would seize total control of what will happen then in the cyberspace. And then there was the question is, if you upload stuff like that into the database, who's going to label it? Now we understood also from the presentation of Mrs. Kenderdine that you can tell very interesting stories, and I mean, the Arab world is one of the regions where you have the most precious artifacts in the museum. So what kind of fantastic stories could you tell? But on the other side, we found that especially in a very restrictive political and society framework, it's not very easy to find somebody who can tell a story. So there were technical problems, yes, but there were also, I would say, some shortcomings when it comes to attitude and strategy. Although the good story here was that I think all museums to some extent understood that they have to build a database. Also, if it's not for other reason, but to secure their artifacts to some extent. Then there were the fascinating countries which we labeled as digital basics, and those include Tunisia, Lebanon, Palestine. And these countries were much more open when it came to discussing digital strategies in museums and how to use digitization to implement the goals of the museum. For instance, reach additional audience, reach different audiences. Use digitization to advance also some political topics, although very, very carefully. Here, another problem became apparent was that the state class, so to say, seems to neglect the topic of culture. So the museums are left on their own, so to say, and they have to raise funds in a very adverse and very, very difficult climate to advance their goals here. So here it's not so much political restrictions, but rather financial and operational restrictions. Those countries could do more if they had the money to do so. Then you see on the lower half, countries like Qatar, and we call the digital islands. They have the most precious and fantastic museums in the world. They have all the financial means to do anything they want. However, what we found interesting, and we focused very much on the literature available, for instance, on the new Islamic Museum in Doha, was that those museums were raising discussions within the local societies, because they were assumed that those museums have very little to do with the local society. So they were there, they were maintained by Westerners, they use money to buy also artworks from Europe. They also, by the way, bought lots of artworks from other Arab countries. So during the embargo, most of the Iraqis that had modern art were at one point had to sell their art, and now the Doha Museum has one of the most precious collections of Iraqi modern art. So they were fulfilling their role as an archive to some extent, but they are not in the position to discuss the future of their societies, because they are perceived as being very, very alien. Although what we found interesting looking at the literature in Doha was that although it is not very well perceived to have political open debates, this Western museum did cause a debate because the local society was discussing whether such a museum really makes sense here. And I think there was even a debate whether to have the old Doha Museum back. The old Doha Museum, to mind you, had the size of 2 living rooms, but it meant very much for the local population to some extent. So finally we came to the conclusion that maybe to develop a museum for change, we had in mind, be it right or wrong, maybe that could be a kind of combination, using the experience and using the ambition for countries that are in the digital basics quadrant, combining that, for instance, with the experience, with the financial resources, and with the ambitions of digital islands. Maybe there could be something coming out of it. So I think none of those museums, either in the digital basics nor in the digital island quadrant, can do it by itself, but there has to be some kind of combination. So finally then we came to the conclusion, and together with our partners we came up with 3 possible strategies, which Carsten will discuss with you.
Well, not so much discuss as barely trigger, since we are running out of time here, but the first thing that we want to stress is museums ideally are social places. Especially in many Arab countries, there is not a whole lot of public as in a space for debate, for encounters. A lot of that seems to be very limited. So a lot of what museums will have to do is necessarily based in presence formats, not necessarily digital. Digital formats might also be more way of driving traffic into, driving people to attend certain things, to interact, to turn the museum in sort of an entity that's otherwise lacking. We heard that very strongly from Beirut, partly, I'm sure, because the expectation level was far higher than elsewhere. But also in Tunisia, for example, the idea was, well, what the role of a museum really should be is bring people together. And you don't need the latest ultra expensive digital technology necessarily to do that, but you may have to tap into things people are doing already. You may have to interact more with, for example, music festivals, other festivals that are already going on, that are still a lot of the time on Facebook, especially in Tunisia, in certain formats that are recognized. And you just have to find smart ways, smart campaigns, smart moves that are politically not dangerous, but that still allow people to congregate. And ideally, over time, that might lead to sort of an infrastructure where museums are one nodal point in a cultural scene that branches out into many other areas. And the idea with that museums might be one of the repositories of know-how, and perhaps also of a certain very basic technical infrastructure to make that happen. But it's really more about the Chinese grandmother going to this exhibition with her granddaughter and then being so overwhelmed that she sort of takes part and interacts with people who are there. It's not so much about doing the best possible online collection that it merely happens from your computer. Second case in point, there is a lot of stuff that's being digitized, and there's very little that's being done with it. And Ayad basically told you all about that already. So one thing that museums could play a major role in, and this is politically perhaps not all that tricky, this might be naive, but is to just build platforms, networks across various countries to leverage all the content there is in a clearly non-for-profit, etc. environment with protections. This is not like giving all your images to Google Arts and Culture. You know, there are certain things that you don't want to do. So you want to create a specific infrastructure that reaches across the region with a couple of very, high-profile institutions to carry the physical and IT infrastructure, but with many other players being able to slot into that. And that's basically what this weird wireframe diagram here is supposed to say. And Ayad, the third, if you want to push on.
Sure.
I'm just looking at the water. This would be you, right?
Yeah, the third idea, which was probably the most crazy one, was as I mentioned before, was maybe we should pick up one topic and create a kind of light tower project. And that is what I meant before by combining the resources and ideas of the digital islands and other countries which are more open when it comes to culture and politics. And we were discussing that actually before the recent events some time ago, and we thought that, for instance, one important topic that is very sensitive in the Arab world is, of course, the fate of the Palestinian peoples. And then we thought, maybe why don't we create a museum or take it as a topic, a museum that refers to Palestine and the Palestinian people that live all over the place and have experiences in South America, in Europe, in the occupied territories, and also in other Arab countries. And we thought that since the identity of the Palestinians is under so much pressure, this could be an interesting project and something which could also allow perhaps a newer interpretation and perhaps even stronger interpretation than the more traditional ones. So as you see on the picture, still crazy ideas. We thought, can we use the power of the Islamic Museum in Doha and the funds and the possibilities there, and combine it with the ideas of Palestinian artists and also Western artists that are dealing with Palestine, and also combine it with in a digital way with the experience that Palestinians have, and as you see on the picture below, Palestinians have a very, very specific experience when it comes to the digital world, as they are being, so to say, so surveilled by so many people, and their access to digital tools is very, very much in danger and under scrutiny. So these were the three ideas we had. One, so to say, combining old and new. One is to create a platform that could help Arab museums in their digital processes, but also be a kind of platform for digital exhibitions of those museums. So the platform will give the museums, but it will also provide them with an opportunity to upload their artifacts, and also with a call for a really interesting light tower project that is not a digital island, but is very close to the problems of the local population. So thank you very much for your attention. Any questions at that stage?
I have a question tagged to a comment. I don't know if it's the time now or a bit later.
Sure.
So you presented the 4 quadrants, and I was wondering if actually on the x-axis it is actually just purely economical money rather than actually digital nativity of those places. So I'm asking, are we talking about a third axis here, which is how much money do those countries have in order to provide this? Or is it really their awareness about what they have? That's the question that I have. And the comment that I had is the example that you presented, Ayad, with the scientist talking at the theater. how different is this from actually like a think tank? I was present here in Berlin in one of those sessions, and at some point the theater stopped, the play stopped, and we needed to actually just, you know, impersonalize and get into this role and start discussing. And then I looked at my husband at that time. I was like, this is a workshop. Why should we be actually at 9 o'clock spending our time at a workshop brainstorming ideas? So the third question that I'm asking is, where does the museum as a spatial and temporal place where people intrinsically and extrinsically meet in order to dialogue those artifacts, to actually just like a conversation that could happen also virtually over the internet?
First of all, I think concerning the access, of course, a third access is possible, and why not? We just found it interesting that the Arab countries, which seem to have some money, they do spend it on culture. But looking especially at the Gulf countries, our assumption was that this is some part of some kind of soft diplomacy initiative. So they wish to create an image of the region or image of Islam even, which is geared towards the Western audience, which has its merits. So if people come together and if Westerners feel that this is a platform they can engage with, perfect. But it's not so much doing anything for the local population. So, and one can even have the debate whether the societies in the Gulf regions, despite of all their financial riches, is developing in a certain direction. Of course it is, but I would say it's not part of a wider political debate. And that brings us to your second question: is what the hell is happening to a museum? And I think Carsten, please support me in that as well. I think a museum could have many faces and many possibilities. It could have a very traditional role in safeguarding artifacts and having a discussion about the history. Although even in Arab countries, I would say history is a very debated topic, but also in other countries. And there might be an audience which simply wants to go to the museum and be impressed by art. But there might be times and there might be audiences which want to debate. And our let's say our tricky assumption was to say, okay, if there is one institution in the Arab world which could host such a kind of discussion, then it might be the museum, because it's not a fully politicized space. It is neutral, and it's very close to culture. And that was interesting also feedback from the discussions. Culture which is very close to the hearts and minds of the people in the region. So culture can provide security in times like these, but it could also encourage for further discussion. So that was the aim we have.
I think if I may add to that, I think what museums are not terribly good at in general is really changing from a space that is unidirectional, meaning, you know, there's something that the museum puts there and then you're supposed to receive it, to something that is more of a social experience, that is more a mix. You go somewhere, you meet potentially other people, you may sort of be presented with opinions that you don't share, or, you know, views that are new to you. You may hopefully be unsettled. And I think technology, the digital technology, certainly has a role to play in providing that experience that classical museums are not really great for. I think, as you know, Sarah had some excellent examples of how you can engage people in a more active way than just walking through a gallery and looking at something. Second point, having said that, I think the type of public space that is created merely by, for example, having an opening where lots of people come and sort of interact with a topic that is being presented by the museum, and ideally, you know, start talking to one another about that. I think that in itself is truly valuable already. And there aren't all that many spaces where that sort of chance interaction between different people in the same society can happen in many places in the Arab world.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to go to our next speakers now. I think they're already biting their nails. So I'm sorry about the delays. My fault. So I cannot even blame it on somebody else. So next would be Christine Khoury, if possible. I think we have a somehow shaky internet connection, so we keep our fingers crossed. And you will tell us about the experience of the Arab Image Foundation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let me share. All right. Here we go. Well, first, thank you to everyone, for the invitation today. And I will go through and tell you a little bit about the Arab Image Foundation, because I will not assume that anyone knows what the organization is, and speak a bit more near the end about our digital practices and our work around digitizing and building a new platform, and some of the hopes that we have, as well as the challenges that we're facing. So the Arab Image Foundation, sorry, let's see. All right, there we go. So the Arab Image Foundation was founded in 1997 in Beirut, Lebanon, as an association, a nonprofit association, based on the deliberate intention to collect, preserve, and study photographs from the Middle East, North Africa, and their diaspora. The context in which this came up is in the post-war reconstruction period after the 15-year-long civil war of Lebanon. There was a lack of initiatives in heritage preservation and an urge to salvage histories. There was no public support. There's no structure to host and preserve these collections at that time, and very little, if at all, any today. The foundation works at the intersection of artistic creation, research, and archiving, and we explore and question and confront complex social and political realities of our times. At the time that the foundation was established in 1997, Lebanon was undergoing a period of reconstruction. There were a number of artists, Fuad Al-Khouri, Samir Mahdad, Akram Zatari, as well as Zaina Arida, who were aware of the lack of initiatives in preserving the region's photographic heritage and how critical it was to salvage it. They had access to photographic collections, and there was no public support, as mentioned. So out of their initiative is really how the foundation was established. The first 7 years of the foundation was really focused around researching, collecting, and studying on visual photographic heritage from Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, Iran, Iraq, as well as countries from the Arab diaspora, in particular Mexico, Argentina, and Senegal. Research missions to acquire collections with time slowed down, and currently we have 306 collections amounting to more than 500,000 photographic objects. Some of them date as far back as 1860. These collections come from different sources: family photographs, photographic studios, professional photographers, and also vernacular photography. So I'll just take you through so you can see some of these images. So you can see some of these family collections range from showing, of glass plates showing wealthy life in Lebanon and Egypt at the turn of the century. There are studio collections as well. And the focus on Arab diasporic collections, has really brought in another way of thinking about what the Arab world is, what the geographic boundaries of the Arab world is, to think well beyond, maybe in a way that you mentioned, the Palestinian diaspora, and trying to imagine what that looks like. So what's one of the sort of main pillars of the foundation is to really think about the photograph as an object. As an institution that was established by artists and researchers, the foundation doesn't function as a conventional archive per se, but rather as a bridge between archival practices and contemporary artistic and research practices. Over the last few years, we've come to rethink our approach to archival practice. We don't think of these photographs as images, mere images, but rather as objects, each with its set of physical attributes and deteriorations. The information on each photograph is another layer that we do our best to preserve and highlight. And this is something that is present both in our physical and our digital practices. So in terms of preservation and conservation, our work is focused on preventative measures. We don't use complex reconstructive treatments for any of our collections. Dry and wet surface cleaning are the only procedures applied, and our objective is to avoid and minimize further deterioration or loss, but we never interfere with the item on a structural level or change its appearance. And of course, with that, we ask this question of what should we be preserving and how should we be doing that? What that looks like is, what is written on the back of the image itself, how to capture that, thinking about the craft of the archival, the practice of the photographers. Here you see the work from the Photojac studio, which were these books that were made that held negatives. And so really trying to understand what the morphology of these objects are and how to preserve not only, again, the images in those negatives, but in fact, the whole object and the whole practice of the photographer himself is something that we're committed to. Even in the case of, and this, I speak about this because this flows over into our digitization work, because it certainly parallels the same practice of what we're trying to do with digitization. So, so in the same way that we are, capturing these objects as they show their deterioration, when we digitize, this is exactly what happens, is in the same way. There's no retouching that happens of the image. Here, it's when we digitize images, we put if they're negatives, the negative and the positive image is what we put online. I will just mention quickly, and I'll come back to the digitization in a bit, but our cold storage room, which is what allows us to hold on to and care for these physical objects, is a very central core part of the foundation physically and sort of in our practice. The foundation exists as a space where we operate and work, but also invite people to come to the space through open days, through residencies, through different workshops. So here are some images to sort of see how people engage with the collections and with our team. With that physicality is the reality of where we are, Beirut. And so the explosion in Beirut on the 4th of August last year was quite detrimental to many people and organizations within the city, as well as cultural institutions. And I would say that from my, from what I think is that the Arab Image Foundation, their proximity to the port. So just to show some images of, what some of the challenges are that we deal with. This is obviously quite extreme, but unfortunately is the something that we've had to deal with, where you see computers on the floor, you see equipment that was damaged. So the precarity of just the infrastructure and the reality of this country is one of the biggest challenges that we face. So for digitization, the foundation has been digitizing since the early 2000s, if I'm correct. The approach, and it really began with a first online platform that was launched in 2006 with 25,000 images. So digitization is not new to the foundation, but in fact has been a practice for now over a decade and a half. And the sort of move towards developing a second platform, an updated one, began in 2010, and its beta version launched in 2019. So here, again, some of the images. So the approach to conservation, as I mentioned, really led to a new approach in digitization, where capturing the unique qualities of the object, the different layers and materialities or materials that make up the object and how they've interacted with one another and in the environment over time is really important. So holding those histories and making that visible within our process and through the digitization process is something that we aim to do. In the digital realm, these digital surrogates not only protect, but give access to and encourage research and generate many narratives, of course. How we preserve the entirety of an object has influenced our approach in capturing these unique qualities, and which also means thinking about different captions, for example. You'll see that, as I mentioned, negatives and positives are made available, but sometimes there are additional images that show the deterioration of the object as well, which again is part of the history of the object that we're keen to share. At the same time, with our digitization practice, we are exploring post-custodial model, where we digitize objects and physical objects may not be physically held at the Arab Image Foundation. And this is something that we're thinking about these days. So the new platform that launched in 2019 is still in its beta 2 years later, but that's how it goes. It was a huge milestone for the Arab Image Foundation, which which right now the platform currently hosts 80 of our collections. The intention is that the public can browse through a set of images, interact with our collection. Eventually, there may be online residencies and educational programs that will take place through the platform or online. It makes what's important about this platform is that it makes our collections available to researchers and to the public in a way that's quite unprecedented. To come and visit the foundation to physically see these objects may be impossible for most people. It's also very time consuming and difficult, and caring for those physical objects and moving them in and out of different environments is something that we have to consider every time. So just to show you some of the pages from the platform. So currently we have 28,000 objects online. We have about 40,000 ready to be uploaded, but of course, due to technical challenges, we're working on how to get those up. There's one area that on the platform called the lab page, which is meant to create to create and share research in an online environment. It's a virtual lab that's meant to simulate a photographic object. So much like a multi-layered photograph, artists, academics, and researchers are invited to experiment with the collection and ultimately create their own layers and readings of information using our collections. So this is something that exists, but it does not exist in the way that we would like it to. So it's in the process of, the development is proceeding. And this is an area where we're hoping to engage technologists and artists who may have experience and try to imagine what the functionality of this can do. And of course, aside from the collections being available on the platform, there are different areas that sort of highlight different ways to engage with the foundation. Historically, different public programs like workshops and talks, residencies, are highlighted there, as well as our library. And so I'll maybe just end, I think I'm close to time, is to speak a little bit more about our challenges of dealing with the digital. So we know, first and foremost, physical and digital preservation and care for these objects is financially costly, number one. It also requires particular expertise, which we are lucky to have much of, but also always, at times are still seeking people who have particular expertise, which is hard to find in the country. We've been very lucky to have a network of organizations working in conservation and also digital collections that we are connected to. So we're not on our own, but in terms of physically in Lebanon, there are certainly more challenges in finding certain expertise that we're looking for. On a basic level in Lebanon, infrastructure is one of the biggest challenges that we deal with. It's something that most people in the world take for granted, that you have electricity and water. This is something that we don't have all the time. So electricity is unstable. We suffer from major power cuts, often 12 hours a day. What that means is, our servers can't be online as easily. Our backups are not as safe. The electricity going on and off. These are such basic things, but are huge challenges in terms of how we can deal with and take care of our physical and digital collections. In thinking about caring for our digital surrogates, digital preservation is, of course, a challenge that all GLAM organizations and everyone is dealing with. So we are in the boat with everyone else in thinking about and dealing with those challenges. I would say also trying to find people who understand the values of our organization. We're not focused on mass digitization, getting numbers of images online, but really thinking critically about what it means to digitize these objects, when we shouldn't digitize certain objects, and when they are, what kinds of narratives and stories are told, of course. So whether that's the basic metadata, but also how do we ethically and critically engage people and organizations to think about these collections so that they have meaning beyond just the object and their basic metadata. Of course, thinking about sustainability is one of the biggest challenges. So building a platform is a big commitment, and you have to maintain it and sustain it. And we know technology changes all the time. So again, these are some of the challenges that not only we face, but many, and if not all institutions and individuals face at the same time. Another challenge that we would say is a pushback against the love and desire for open access for cultural heritage collections. These are images, they're photographs, mostly with people in these photographs. There are a lot of different rights and things to be considering very seriously with these images, and we don't own the copyright to these images. So, deciding to make them Creative Commons is not something we would do. And as we know, as technology is developing, and there's maybe more and more of a concern around what it means to make material available online, has been mentioned before, what can happen on the internet, but really on a more serious level on the legal level of how to think about what it means for people to have access to collections with people's faces, for example, in these images. So I would say our beta platform has been a long project. It continues to be a major project for the foundation. It's something we're quite committed to. It's an ongoing space of development, and that's something that we really want to have people come to understand, that an online space is a space where things will be changing all the time, and to sort of expect that from the foundation as well. We have been looking for, it was a struggle to find a creative technologist to help us develop the platform, in fact, and we had a call a few months ago. We were lucky to find someone, in fact, not in the country, unfortunately, or as it is, to help us, kind of take our platform to where it needs to go. And again, think about these questions of sustainability. With that is also someone who not only has a technical knowledge in how to do this, but also thinks very creatively about new ways to have people interact with these collections. So whether that means different interfaces, because different collections call for those different ways of looking at these images or looking at these objects. So I think that I will maybe stop there, and I'm happy to answer any further questions on the foundation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Looking at the time, if everybody would accept, I think there has been one or two questions which I take note of. Would it be acceptable that we move on to Nora's presentation, and then maybe if time allows, we take the remaining questions for both of you? Is that acceptable? I hope.
That sounds great. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for understanding. Again, I have to take the blame for this delay. So Nora, can we ask you to start your presentation?
Yes. Okay. I'm already in the process. 1 second.
Hurry up.
Okay. It's here. It's here. I will be talking today a little bit more actually about museums of the Global North, but you can inverse all I'm saying, and that could be an avant-gardistic museum in the MENA region, actually. That's what I just thought when I listened to all your inputs and discussions. And of course, Christine, I know the Arab Image Foundation. It's I think, very well known and fantastic organization for so long around. So congratulations to that. This avant-gardistic MENA museum we are thinking of maybe is also, just a few thoughts in the beginning that I just wrote down as notes now, is maybe not focusing or even not fetishizing objects and artifacts as it is so much done here in the Global Northern museums and the imperial museums, but be, as all of you said, social, societal spaces that are relevant and that are celebrating the living cultures actually beyond, for example, also beyond the nation state. After all, I think museums are epistemic spaces, and I think I've been pondering some thoughts more in recent months about the statelessness of data sets. So this is, I think, when we talk about digitization of any kind, basically, something quite revolutionary, which is inherent, which is on the one hand also a threat, I think, to many ideologies we see around, all the classical ideologies, let's say. So let me get started with some other small provocations maybe, but of course the question here is always who is provoking whom, because I would say that dear museums and colonial nations of the Global North, that their data sets are haunting them. Because of course now with Corona, digitization of museum collections became even more a thing. Yet in many places, I would say, like contradicting to what you have said earlier, many places here in Berlin, it really is not such a big thing in a way, or it still didn't as it could maybe. So I believe it's a good moment to share some reflections on the ongoing cultural fights over digital assets, also copy fraud and indigenous data, and of course the topic of restitution here, because it's all very much entangled. But yeah, before I start, maybe one other thing which is very important to me. We live as much in a post-digital as much as in a post-colonial world. So in the end, the whole debate, what we are discussing here is not so much about the kind of licenses or question of accents, but who owns cultural data and who controls it, and perhaps to whom it's attributed. So digitization manifested a notion here in the global north that museums, beside having the monopoly over physical objects, also became, we call it in Germany, Datenkraken, like a data octopus. That means they're collecting data sets of their possessions and, well, sometimes even of the audiences. I mean, why not? It's all for the good experience of you in the museum space. So these practices led to moments where I would have now to mention the British Museum when I'm digitally publishing or remixing this artifact you can see here on the screen from Iraq, the beautiful Lamassu. So maybe you can already tell where this is leading me to. I have to go a bit quicker maybe. So I think it's important that a new discussion about the originality and truth of data, as well as about material objects of other cultures and their agency, is much necessary because of this institutional practices of museums and collections in the global north, where museums tell fictional stories, often even without realizing it, but they are the museum's own stories because they control the artifacts as well as their digital derivatives. So I like sometimes to compare the museum with the Hakawati from Hakka, of course, you know, to tell, to relate in Arabic, the traditional Arab storyteller who is herself labeled as heritage actually and ancient. And the essence of the Hakawati is the way the story is conveyed, how you tell it, how you bring it to life with spectacle and fury. And many museums are doing this, but somehow in the wrong way, I think. So I think it's very important that artifacts, when we talk about old artifacts, of course, there are many distinctions, and I don't want to oversimplify things, but when we talk about contemporary pictures with faces and people in it, it's a different story. But I want to talk about material culture of objects, and to be fair, that some museums do collaborate with companies such as Google Arts and Culture and get very much celebrated. But this can be seen as another striking moment of privatization of cultural data that are and that should remain on a public domain. So yes, it's good to be hesitant, it's good to be critical as an institution, but if that also leads to not publishing anything, that is also the wrong outcome, I guess. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is a very proprietary practice of such like big five companies that would do anything for you as a customer, I think. Yeah, and let me go a bit quicker here. So recently, there was an article about one work I would like briefly to introduce to you. It's called The Other Nefertiti. I did this in 2015 and 16 with Jan Nicolai Nelles. It was also called the Nefertiti Hack. And just 1 month ago, this article popped up again, because it's a topic, it's still out there, it's still not really solved, which is good. We have the discourse, but also it's a bit sad, I think, how slow things are moving in a way. So before I talk about it, so I need to do one thing quickly. I have to stop it because I forgot to allow the sound for you. Just a second, I have to, there we are, okay. There we are. Zack. Okay.
Now, there's a German equivalent of the Elgin marbles. It's the bust of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, which sits in a museum in Berlin rather than in the vicinity of its creator.
So the bust of Queen Nefertiti is a 3,000-year-old work of art that was found in Egypt by German archaeologists
In 1912, who discovered the house and the workshop of the sculptor, a man named Thutmose.
Currently, it's in a museum in Berlin with limited access to the public. Basically, there are no photos allowed. And for years, Germany and Egypt have fought over its rightful location, and the officials even claim that she was illegally stolen.
Now, the Egyptians would love to have that bust back, but the Germans have guarded it jealously, even banning photographs. So it is pretty amazing that two artists have succeeded in taking a full 3D scan of the bust. Here they are, secretly scanning back in October last year.
So two artists secretly 3D scanned the bust and released the files to the public as a free download. Although museums have already scanned Nefertiti's bust, they actually don't plan to make it public, which seems kind of backwards because there's a lot of museums around the world that are hosting scan-a-thons. That's where they let people use their smartphones to take a bunch of pictures of things, objects, and to make 3D scans of them.
Now, it sounds a bit like Ocean's 11 or one of these movies. What I don't understand is, I mean, this thing is obviously guarded, right? And you must have been there for, what, a few hours? And how did you not get caught? I mean, how did you disguise yourself?
This is like pirate 3D printing, folks. So we thought we would download the file and 3D print it ourselves on our 3D printer. We're amazed just how much detail was captured in the model. I mean, every little crack, chip, and scratch is fully visible, which is no surprise because the mesh has a whopping 9 million polygons. It's so detailed that if you throw it in your slicing software, it'll probably
crash. Exactly. I love this hacker dude. Yes, so I mean, I could talk for hours about only this project because it had many implications in Egypt as well as in Germany. But I called it like tried to make it really, really quick here. What I wanted to say with it also, what you didn't see in this video, it was the bust the data set of the bust got remixed thousands of times online. And people literally 3D printed the bust in any color form you can imagine. And of course, we could now argue whether this is appropriate or not, or this has something to do with bad taste, which is really one of the most popular arguments of museums, why they don't want to share the data sets. But I would say that especially those very powerful data sets, they can't be contained. They'll always be hacked and leaked. And once they are on a public domain, and I would say it's a good thing, and once they are on a public domain, you can add any copyright or any license, but it actually basically does not mean anything. But it's also, I would say, the virality and the afterlife of the cultural data sets that has a certain beauty and the power. It's kind of an updating of the collection, if you want so. And it's also an activation of the ghosts and of the artifacts themselves, which I like to call techno-heritage, which is the heritage that does not just look in the past, but also in the present and the future. And of course, this project was like all I do, basically, everything I'm telling you today, I try to have this in my decolonial practice where technology is really just a tool, but that can be emancipatory. It can always be misused, of course, but I would like always to shed the light on the emancipatory part, which is absolutely there. And because of the discussion which was there earlier, I would say that everything what I'm showing you is certainly something that is, doable for just a single person with not so much money. So it's rather cheap fakes than deep fakes, speaking in the terms of technology. And much like DIY mentality, which I know for institutions, it's not always what they can do or want to do, but maybe it's better than to do nothing, for example. So, and decolonial, just very briefly for this project with a Nefertiti bust. Here you can see the 3D printed bust, which before I even leaked the data set, exhibited in Cairo. And that is also part of that decolonial practice of recentering and thinking really where to put our artistic practices and the data sets also. That was the thing in Cairo. I want to be a bit more quick. There is a lot of institutional angst in the museums here in the global north to lose control over the Deutungshoheit of the means of representation about the object. And I think they are right to be afraid so. But it's a good thing because what you want, I guess, and what I've heard and read from all of you is also that we want multiple voices and we don't just want one gatekeeping institution telling the only story, basically, or trying to tell the only story. And I think it's also interesting to think about the digital object really as an original object of itself. And for many people, there is not the necessity for the real thing even anymore. It's unrealistic, as Christine also mentioned, that everyone would visit everything, basically. It's not desirable. And this is also something that very much pushes against the ideology of the Universal Museum, which there is no Universal Museum. No matter how hard we try, not everyone can come, and not everyone is even welcome, especially in the global north. It's very limited actually who can come and for whom also those museums are made. And I personally would say that the Humboldt Forum, the Prussian castle we were showing earlier, is really one of the worst examples for all of this, but we can discuss this later, maybe. Here's something which is, I think, a good example. It's called from Mukurtu. It's a platform for indigenous data sets. And it gives us a lot of ideas how we can deal with respect, that also realize not all data wants to be free, basically, and they'll give labels to objects that are, for example, only for women, or that are secret, sacred, that are actually not accessible for everyone. And that's very important because in many cultures in the whole world, the digital object holds the same power as the original. And I think it's a very strong idea. And to me, this resonates a lot, actually, because of course I'm a digital media artist. For me, the digital object is original. Otherwise, I kind of wouldn't do what I'm doing, I guess. And for example, also there was, but this is more about restitution. It's a big topic. I think I will skip this today, where there were really good solutions with indigenous communities in New Zealand, where the museum really handed over the power to decide about the whole collection to the indigenous community. And it ended up not with an empty museum, but I would say with a more relevant museum, of course, with a few less objects, but still, it was just really very much reorganized, but sincerely with the power at the communities that were actually affected by this. So yeah, in a way, I always try to stress that my proposal is also the willingness to restitute it all, and also the willingness, therefore, by these institutions in a constant process of negotiating and questioning their own collections and provenances. And yes, so one other project, because I wanted to talk also about another technology that is AI-based technologies that are very interesting now. And also they get more and more accessible, and you need less and less computing power. And that's, I think, where the emancipatory part of the technology also comes back. So this is images here you see. It's another recent project, a work of mine that I actually did in the Institute for Experimental Museology with Sarah. That was, I'll talk about that in a second. So it's called Babylonian Vision and Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture Series. And I think this kind of idea, it's always the question how we will use and shape technology to make really sense of culture. And the interesting part with AI or machine learning is that it makes patterns visible. Also those that we didn't know about, or those that are not talked about in our societies. So the media theorist Wendy Chan described this in her essay, Queering Homophilia, that machine learning can offer the generative power of discomfort. And discomfort is something that is at the heart of decolonization, as I'm sure you all know, and you all experienced this. And therefore, for this kind of practice, I think there are a few things with regards to AI that are really worthwhile to write and spell it out. One of the things is that most of these technologies, also the 3D part, which I was showing earlier, are neither mastered nor fully understood by the colonizer. And by the colonizer, I mean the museum as a colonial machine. So following this thought, the database can be seen as a political and emancipatory inanimate thing that is not bound or controlled by global power structures necessarily. On the contrary, I would say it can be a means of overcoming them. So with this work, I'm expanding on a decolonial machine learning based museum practice with newly generated archaeological artifacts from Iraq, as you can see them here. And why also AI? Another reason is because due to the amount of information AI always includes by default, we can somehow talk also about a collective consciousness and a collective agency inherent in the technology. No matter if it's based on images or text. So then we are dealing, and we talk a lot about this, but only with a focus on the problematic side, namely the biases. That is the collective consciousness of a racialized society. But I also know that you can train AIs differently, and then it becomes a very interesting thing. What I think Marx called it general intellect, or Foucault called it episteme, or Simondon called it transindividual. As another friend of mine, Professor Matteo Pasquinelli, once summarized it. So 5 more minutes. I try to really be short with this project. It's a bit complicated to explain it, so I'll really try to do my best, because it's a new technology. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure what is going to happen, because we are over time, but I don't know whether this suddenly stops then and the screen becomes black. But because this is so interesting, I would just say just continue and we see what happens.
I try 3 minutes, and then we can get the chance to discuss a little bit. Okay, in 3 minutes to explain this project, what we did was we illegally scraped and web crawled websites of the largest collections in the world with Mesopotamian artifacts from Iraq that are all based in the global north. And I don't need to tell you which ones they are, and I won't, because that's a legal issue then. And then with this, we trained the AI to generate new artifacts. This is the input data set, some parts of it. And this is about the technology. And here you can see how the AI is actually learning to understand the form. So the technology, we know it better as deepfakes, where we can generate new images of faces if we train the AI with enough faces. So of course, we can do the same with artifacts. And it's very interesting, this kind of wandering through material worlds and patterns that we cannot grasp as humans as many. And it's of course a little bit also to what archaeologists are trained to do, to see the patterns, but not necessarily to recreate them in a different manner. So this form of techno-heritage for me was very important. It's more an autobiographical project, because I'm half Iraqi, and I was really tired of hearing about my country always about losing objects or destruction. And I think there is so much more we could talk about. So this was also a positive contribution to generating new artifacts and new images, image worlds that relate to the places like Iraq, Mesopotamia, or Babylon, which are also very interesting fictional places with no clear borders. Yes, so yes, here are a few images for like individual works that, yeah, you can see them. So maybe the last part, the most one where you can see, I think, I don't know, the decolonial aspect in this work was mostly that basically there are 2 things. One is that no one can trace back. It's the black box problem of AI, which is usually a problem that no one can tell what data sets were really used to train the AI. And that can be problematic if the output is biases or if we have privacy issues. But in my practice, it's actually emancipatory, because the museums can't prove that I actually used their data sets. So that's one decolonial aspect. The other one is also very important, and I really want to share this slide here. That's the reality of technology too, that most of the data sets that I use to train AIs are really very hard global north dominated. So 80% around are from the US and UK alone. And China is also a big player, but not on this one. So that leads to a very, very, I don't know, obvious visual hegemony that we really don't want. And I would hope for a future where we have more local trained AIs that relate to the context, just like the museums, and that are thereby by default more ethical and more just and representative for the people they actually affect. And I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. So I want to extend my thanks to all of the presenters who had the chance and spend their time discussing this. I think it was really a great journey, trying to find out what is possible, trying to figure out what possible strategies could be, listening to Christine and understanding, what are the possibilities and the options and the restrictions, and finally Nora telling us how all those things come together. And what I found especially interesting in the last presentation was that the search for culture, or the restitution of culture, also leads to the question is who owns the data. So maybe the discussion about who owns Arab culture would also encourage the Arab people on starting a debate about who owns who owns data and who owns those platforms that are dominating the Arab world. So past, present, and future all come together. So thank you very much for your presentation. It's all very, very, very impressive. I think we still have 2 minutes. Nobody appeared and cut the whole thing off. So if there are any more questions, please put them forward. There was one written by Abdul Karim, I think, pointing to the future of the museum and pointing his finger in the direction that will this lead to different kind of skills and different kind of jobs in the museums? And I would probably say yes. On the long run, probably we are not here yet, but this is something that could be happening. But what we also learned from Christine and also from Nora's and Sarah's contribution was that we probably definitely need new skills. Skills that have to do with digitization, that have to do with legal issues, and also probably people that know very well how social media works and how to reach out for new audiences and things like that. So please, if there are any more questions, I would welcome them from the audience.
I would maybe just add sort of to that comment and also to your presentation, Ayad, is in terms of imagining different kinds of collaborations where there's equity and like real exchange and content in another, which is often the case. And I think that there's a lot of possibility for that, that may be either within the Arab world, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are, very important power dynamics that occur within the Arab world, that just because an Arab country like Qatar, if they choose to work with an organization in Lebanon, that may be very political as well. So to acknowledge that it's not so simple, that the global north to global south, but also within the Arab world, I'm sure more than anyone how that there are a lot of different considerations. And I think that even the proposal to think about how to engage Palestinian diaspora, I actually want to point to the work of Shara Doumani, who was one of the people who had imagined the Palestinian Museum and really tried to imagine it as an archipelago. And, I think where there are possibilities in the archive in that way, there are so many possibilities technologically to imagine how to build these connections, and that there is so much that can happen and that hopefully will happen. Sometimes it's not just the lack of, maybe an expertise, but also really it's about bringing a number of different brains together to imagine what that could look like, and not just financial resources.
I think that was thank you for that comment. That was also the idea of creating this Arab platform, because what was striking for us, that when we talked to representatives of Arab museums, that most of their collaborations were with the global West. So yep. I don't know why that is the case, because maybe they are more technologically advanced or so, but there seems to be very little cooperation amongst Arab museums for some reason, and that has to do, of course, with the political situation, or maybe with the idea that they don't have anything to offer, so we have to look to the Metropolitan Museum because this is where all the action is, or something like that. So I think that's a very important topic, and if I'm allowed to say so, that's the general I would say thread that is running through all those presentations during Raqamiyya. Is we found the same situation also in the economic sphere, where you have the same situation of dominating Western and Chinese platforms, the loss of data, the protection of data, and it's always the same thing. And of course, culture is no exception. But I'm always curious that I think a region that has no access to its own culture any longer is really a hopeless case. So I'm really hoping that we will find a way to increase the potential or increase the digital visibility of Arab culture one way or another.
I maybe just want to add one thing, is that, the focus on museums, and many of these museums have some sort of government affiliation, is maybe where a lot of the challenges are. But you know, an organization like the Arab Image Foundation or many other cultural organizations, you know, there are hundreds of museums in Palestine. They're just not big official museums. And I think that there is a lot of collaboration that does happen regionally. It's just not as visible and as flashy necessarily as sort of the, you know, maybe what big museums that have some sort of state affiliation often case may have. So I think looking to these civil society oriented cultural institutions is also another strategy where perhaps those are sites of more substantial possibility for change than sort of larger institutions overall in the world, right? Not just art like museums per se and in the region.
Yeah. Maybe this is the way we have to go. Yeah. All right. If there are no questions from the audience, then I would like to thank you all very much. We were very honored to have you amongst us, and thank you for your time and your efforts and your participation here. Thank you so much. Thank you also for the audience for your appearance, and I hope to carry on this discussion with you or some of you in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here.
Thanks for having us. Bye bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you very much.